Recently, we did a devotional on Ephesians where we talked about Paul's use of a marriage allegory. And we talked about how Paul maybe had some things that don't translate 2,000 years later. We've had the benefit of the last 2,000 years to discover more things about what it means to love our neighbors and to care for one another. And certainly marriage has changed drastically in that time. The concept of love has transformed, at least romantic love and marital love. And so we're going to read a passage today that may also strike some discomfort. And we're going to acknowledge again that Paul was a product of his time, living in the culture that he lived in, and Paul was human, not perfect. So let's take a look here. Ephesians 6, starting in verse 5. As for slaves, obey your human masters with fear and trembling and with sincere devotion to Christ. Don't work to make yourself look good and try to flatter people, but act like the slaves of Christ, carrying out God's will from the heart. Serve your owners enthusiastically as though you are serving the Lord and not human beings. You know that the Lord will reward every person who does what is right, whether that person is slave or a free person. As for masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Stop threatening them, because you know that both you and your slaves have a master in heaven. He doesn't distinguish between people on the basis of status. Okay, so let's go ahead and acknowledge it. Paul is wrong in using slavery to give an example of how we ought to be with Christ. And while he's not necessarily advocating for slavery, it's important to note this passage has been used for centuries to defend slavery, even today, believe it or not. But still, I struggle with Paul's usage of talking about God as our master and us as God's slaves. Slavery carries with it not only a sense of subjugation, but also a dehumanization, a treatment that comes with immense harm. We are not owned by one another. We ought not be bought by one another. I don't think I have to make a devotional that argues against slavery. So you get what I'm saying. So what do we do with passages like this, where we read Paul, who seems to somehow at least be okay with things like slavery, that we now know are horrific realities of life? What do we do with those passages? Do we just throw them away? Do we just discount them altogether? I don't think we can discount them altogether, because here again, we're simply reading Paul as a product of his time. What we can actually glean from this passage is that we are to serve one another. Not in a slave sense, but we are to serve one another. We are to recognize the needs of one another and to serve without grumbling. I think that word serving has had a certain connotation in our culture for so long that it's hard for us to use it in the church. But to serve others without expecting something for ourselves is exactly what Jesus teaches us to do. Remember when Jesus sat with his disciples at the Last Supper and they were arguing about who was the greatest among them, and Jesus says, the greatest among you is like the one who serves. Serving is an important part of who we are as Christians. And I think that's much of what Paul was talking about. That doesn't make his use of slavery as an allegory correct or excusable. It does, however, remind us that Paul was not perfect. Paul was human. You and I are human. We are going to make mistakes. I use this example sometimes when talking about Paul. I am not Paul, but I think in many ways I'm trying to do what Paul did, help people discover the good news of Jesus Christ. And I give a sermon every week. Now, if I were to look back at every sermon I give over my so far 10-year career as a pastor, I would probably find some sermons that I now disagree with. Maybe I'm troubled by. It's because we learn and we grow. We discover new things. We become, hopefully, better people, better Christians, more loving, more like Christ. And so my hope is that we can read things like this from Paul and see his humanity, maybe offer a bit of forgiveness and grace, and trust that, like him, we too will make mistakes. We are following Jesus Christ. We're not perfect. And though we do our best, we will make pretty severe errors. So let's learn. Let's grow. And all the while, continue to serve our brothers and sisters around us. Amen.